But Frankie, I believe we have another panel.
Yes. Do you know any car puns?
Car puns.
Or any sim racing puns? Can you make a car noise?
Okay,
Oh
yeah,
my
I can't
goodness. I didn't even prepare him to do that because our next panel is all about sim racing. Sim racing, the grand plan. And that's your cue to make the noise. It's fine. Don't worry. We should have discussed this beforehand. Thank you very much. So let's welcome on stage, please. First of all, your moderator is Tobin Leigh. He is the founder and CEO of PACENOTE. Come on up, Tobin. Get a feel for the stage.
Yeah,
and
quicker,
Tobin is going to be... Tobin, I've started him. I'm going to let him finish. Tobin is going to be joined by Ben Hawkins, who is the head coach of Esports at Williams Esports. Come on up, Ben. We should have done some smoke machines and everything, shouldn't we? Flashing lights. Yes, thank you very much, ESI London. Keep those hands clapping together for Kieran Holmes-Darby, who's a gaming director at Formula E. I mean, he's been around for quite a while, has Kieran, so it's lovely to have him on stage at ESI London. And last but not least, we have Remer, Rietkerk, who is the head of competitive at RENNSPORT. He hasn't done a panel for 2.5 years, but he's going to bring the action today. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great panel. Everyone, please, round of applause.
Oh, did we forget one? We forgot one.
Oh my gosh. Okay, hang on a second. You're not on my hang on. Okay. Everybody. Oh my goodness, he's the head of esports. Oh my goodness. Okay, sorry. Everybody, give a big vroom vroom to Oliver MacFarlane, who is the head of esports at Mercedes. Woo. So sorry.
Thank you so much, and welcome, welcome, welcome. I am going to be attempting my best to moderate this in an entertaining way as we talk about sim racing and where it sits in the overall esports industry. We'll have a look at how it's going, and we're joined by 4 powerhouses of this industry, genuinely, who can give us a bit of background onto their insights on the space. But I'm Tobin Leigh. I am a former professional sim racer myself. That's how I got into this whole space. I also went and worked with MacFarlane Formula 1 as their esports team manager after competing, and now at the start of this year started my own business called PACENOTE. So I've been properly in the weeds and risked everything really to try and get stuff to work, but it's all about bringing new businesses into the space. And that's my ad over. So I'll pass on to everyone else, and please go ahead and introduce yourselves, and let's hear a bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Tobin. I'm not too sure on being a powerhouse in sim racing, especially not just yet. I'm still relatively new in sim racing. My role, I'm Ben Hawkins. For basically nobody knows me, so for everyone that doesn't know me, my role is head of performance and head coach at Williams Esports. That's misleading. Both those titles, I have 2 roles and they're both misleading. You're not going to get any expert sim coaching from me, and you're not going to even get in-game expertise. I'm probably, I guess, it sounds really egotistical now I'm saying it out loud, but a team principal in F1 is probably more like my role, which is more around sort of strategizing, creating a vision and a culture which allows the actual experts to do the coaching and thrive within it. My background is football and education, and that's what I bring to the table.
Yeah, my name is Kieran. I'm the gaming director at Formula E. Formula E, for those of you that don't know, is the world's leading electric motorsport. It's an accredited FIA World Championship. I've been working there for the past 2 seasons, really with the remit to come in and define everything they're going to do from a digital fan engagement perspective, which includes gaming and esports. Prior to being at Formula E, I was in the esports scene for 7 years running XL Esports, so more on the kind of what I'd say traditional esports side, and now sort of throwing myself into the sim racing world and more broadly gaming, I would say.
I'm Remer Rietkerk. I'm the head of competitive at RENNSPORT. We are a sim racing startup in closed beta, but we're also running the ESLR1, which you guys may have heard of. It's a hopefully relatively large for the sim racing space competition. My background is traditional esports as well, coming from Riot and EA. I've been in this position at 3 months, so I'm trying to bring some of my gaming expertise and my esports expertise to our product here while getting up to speed on sim racing as well. So it's been a fun process.
Yeah, and hi, I'm Ollie. I promise I am supposed to be here, but you can tell I was clearly the last to be added to the panel. I have a dual role at Mercedes, so I've been at the Mercedes F1 commercial team since 2016 with a responsibility for sponsorships, partnerships, etc. in F1, and then since 2020 have led our in-house esports program. So that's probably the amount of time that we've been really focusing strategically on sim racing within Mercedes, and it's come a long way since then, so excited to tell you all about it.
Cool, thank you guys. So we'll begin our proper discussion with a couple questions which we'll ask to everyone, and we'll go down the line and then back along with the various questions to hear what everyone has to say. And the first one that we have is regarding sim racing, and over the last couple of years we've seen debatably some great growth in the sim racing industry, both as an e-sport but also as a real-life racing tool that people can use to get into real cars. And in your guys' opinion, what is one of the biggest, or an example of a development or change in sim racing that has contributed to that? Yes, please, Ben.
Okay. When you put this across, I thought I was sat at the end of the panel and we get to listen to everybody else and then contribute from that. So, am I right in thinking, Tobin, you're talking more around the transition from sim racing into real-world racing?
Either that or just how sim racing has grown as an e-sport.
Okay. Yeah, so for me, in terms of growth in my time, as I said at the very start, I'm relatively new into sim racing. So I don't have a long sort of back catalogue of things to look at in terms of changes. I've been in sim racing sort of since the turn of this year. For me, referring back to something I'm really comfortable talking about would be, sorry to refer back to football, but I think of the sort of Champions League as it is at the moment in terms of Champions League of sim racing. I look at ESL R1, and I think, and many of you listening might be able to relate to this, but I grew up watching Champions League football and being inspired by seeing the greats against each other, and I think that's something that this competition is allowing when you've got people like Seb Job, you've got Josh Rogers, you've got Darren McCormack, James Baldwin, and they've come from iRacing, ACC, F1, and they're being able to compete in the same place. And for me, when I watched the Champions League, that was what appealed to me, and all the great teams as well. It's brought endemic esports orgs into sim racing, and hopefully that'll filter down into the community as well. But for me, it's just like, yeah, watching Steven Gerrard and Xabi Alonso and then going to my back garden and trying to recreate it. I'm seeing guys in our team that are looking at it and going, there's a 1,000th of a second in quali regularly against these guys. This is inspiring. I want to be at that level.
Yeah, okay, really cool. Kieran?
Yeah, so I think sim racing's superpower as an esport is that ultimately it's very similar to the traditional sport, right? Like when you look at something like League of Legends, you can't in real life shoot fireballs out of your hands. But if you look at sim racing, theoretically, the best sim racers could get in a car and be very good at racing, right? So that transferable real world stuff is sim racing's superpower, because it then makes it super interesting when you get people like Lando Norris creating content on Twitch and showing himself sim racing in between his races, because it's very relatable and there's a lot of power in that. That being said, its superpower is also its curse, because a properly produced sim racing race is ultimately, in my opinion, just a slightly lesser version of the real thing. So that's where sim racing has got to get a little bit wise, and something that we've been working really hard at Formula E to do is to differentiate our sim racing product from our real product, but in a way that still has competitive integrity, but is more interesting potentially, and you can do more in that digital world than the real product. So yeah, kind of it's the rise of sim racing is because of that and because of that superpower, but also it comes with a kind of a warning of don't just copy and paste what you're doing in the real world, because it's then just a less interesting version of what you're doing in the real world.
To piggyback on what Kieran said, I think he really hit an important note there about that transferability of skill. But on top of that, the barriers to entry in sim racing are much lower, right? If you want to go racing, you need a racetrack, you need at least a kart or something. When it comes to sim racing, I mean, you can buy a 200 euro wheel and pedals and theoretically be relatively competitive. And you can do it whenever you want, right? 2 in the morning, you're probably not going to the karting track to practice. And so what you're seeing actually is that younger racers, they're all coming up doing both real racing and sim racing, right? Both of these are core to sort of their development and their growth, right? And I think that that's only going to continue to be a thing. And as Kieran said, once we figure out ways to make sim racing, let's say, kind of not a little bit less, but different, but equal to real racing, what you're going to see is these two ecosystems existing alongside each other with drivers transferring back and forth between both of them. And that's when you know that we're really starting to reach our potential as a space.
Yeah, I think I'd add to what you guys have said, which is that the current generation of Formula One drivers who are coming through now, the likes of George Russell, Lando Norris, Alex Albon, these guys, they're evidence of the fact that this generation, for them, racing games have been a completely critical part of them growing up as fans of racing. You know, I think if we put a show of hands who's played racing games in their life, who's played racing games in the last year, I imagine most people, whether it's Mario Kart all the way up to the elite level of sim racing titles we're talking about, people are used to racing. So it's about how do we, to Kieran's point, put an entertainment product on show that illustrates how good these guys are, because the elite level sim racers now are astonishingly good. I think there was a qualifying session in F1 Esports last year where there were only a couple of thousandths of a second between 3 different drivers. You know, these are the margins we're working to. And for us as a Formula One team, one of the really interesting overlaps now that's been a complete change in the last few years is the engineering side as well. So when you're down to those fine margins, or should I say marginal gains, because people love talking about marginal gains in Formula One, now you can start to look at actually sim racing as a talent development opportunity for young engineers coming into the sport and doing some of the similar activities that our F1 engineers are doing around telemetry and data and driver performance improvement that we're used to. And so you're seeing a whole team developing in sim racing, like a mini version of a Formula One team, but learning from what's good about the bigger team around them. So it's an exciting time. I think all of it is still in its infancy, but we're seeing all of those changes coming as we're talking now.
Yeah, 100%. We'll come back, or we'll start with you for this next one, Ollie, and then we'll come back. But targeting in a little bit onto the sim racing to real world racing link, which sim racing is always associated with. In your guys' experience, or even just knowledge of following the industry to date, sim racing is often praised for opening up and bridging the gap, but have there been any benefits as a result of that to you guys in your organizations, and do you perhaps have any examples?
This is the question I didn't want to have to answer first, because I really want to hear what everyone else has to say. It's a great story, right? The idea of a kid never having turned a wheel in real life, but getting really good on the game, getting scouted, and then one day taking their place on the Formula One grid. We'd love to see it. Personally, as we are now in 2023 with the development of sim racing, I don't think it's a helpful story, because actually I don't think we need to hamstring ourselves by saying that success for sim racing is us putting a sim racer on a real life grid. I think actually we can do a lot more to promote sim racing and the brilliant entertainment that it already provides as it is now. To expand on that a little bit, I think actually the opposite is the thing that's helped us a lot. So one of our drivers, for those that don't know, a guy called Jarno Otmeijer, he grew up karting and doing the junior series in the Netherlands in the same sort of generation as Max Verstappen. He, unfortunately, as is quite common, as you mentioned, racing is expensive. He reached a point in his career where his real racing career wasn't going to be able to take off through funding, through opportunity. And so he pivoted into sim racing, is now a 2-time world champion. He's got millions of followers across Twitch, YouTube, etc., and has built a livelihood for himself and a career for himself as a sim racer. So I think actually in the short term, that direction, the young racing driver whose career gets a bit squeezed, maybe it's in their late teens, early 20s, coming into sim racing, is a story that I'd like to explore more. And in the long run, I'd love it. We'd all love it, right? We'd love to see a kid scouted and get onto the F1 grid. But for now, no one's asking the top FIFA player if they're going to turn out for Real Madrid next week. They just enjoy the skill and the talent on show. So that's how I would prefer to look at it.
I'm going to join in on that and say that, as someone who's part of a company making a racing game and trying to build a sim racing ecosystem, I'm more interested to some degree in how we can grow sim racing and what real racing can do for us. And we're starting to see that legitimacy help us, right? Because we have great partners in Mercedes and in Williams who are investing in our sim racing ecosystem and are kind of bringing their incredible brand and awareness and bringing it into our space to help grow it. I think that's really exciting, right? And what's cool with the ESLR1 is one of our kind of identities and things we wanted to achieve with this was to mix sort of real-world racing with the esports space, right? So we have Mercedes, we have Williams racing alongside G2 and Furia and Heroic, and you have a very fun sort of mix of different identities coming together to kind of create this new virtual space.
Yeah, I agree massively with what the guys are saying. I think the reality of where we're at right now is if you put a sim racer without any real track time in a real car, they're going to be much slower than someone who's driven that car most of their life. The same is true the other way around, by the way. You know, when we put our Formula E pro drivers in a sim rig, they're not as quick as the sim racers. So each are better at their own discipline, which is probably quite self-explanatory, but it gives you an understanding of where the gap is at the moment between the digital and the real world. So I agree. We all want that. We all want that, you know, story. And you know, what we do is the winners of our sim racing competition, we put them in a Gen 3 Formula E car to give them some track time. But we're not expecting at the end of that track time for them to be a Formula E driver next year. But it's at least starting them, I suppose, on that journey if they're interested in pursuing it. I think I wouldn't go as far to say it's an unhelpful story. I would say it's probably it's a helpful story in some regard, and it's a nice story to be able to tell. I just don't know how realistic it is until we are able to actually give opportunities to the sim racers to have real track time. Because I remember there was that story of, what was it, an F2 driver who had won something in the F1 Esports series and then he got into F2. But no one was talking about the fact that he was racing an F3 before that. You know, he had a lot of track time in a real car. It wasn't like he went sim rig to F2. So I think we just need to be a little bit realistic about that. I do, however, think there's a massive opportunity more broadly in that digital space to create experiences with sim racing that you can't create in the real world. So a simple activation like when you log into F1 2023 and you can be the car at the back of the grid at the Bahrain Grand Prix 2021 and the cars behave exactly how they did at that Bahrain Grand Prix and you get to experience what it would be like racing in that race. That's such a cool experience for people that only sim racing can offer. So I think if we start to think a bit more around experiential marketing and those pieces, I think sim racing can be a lot more exciting than real racing.
Yeah, I think for me, save you listening to the same things over and over again, I'm in complete agreement with the guys on what they've said. So I'll try and add a slightly different take on it. I agree from a racer point of view that it is a really good pathway for drivers that have had that karting experience, funding's run out, and then they've moved into sim racing. I don't think that's unique to just me and Ollie, that's across all teams. I mean, you look at the F1 sim racing grid and most of those guys have karting backgrounds. What I want to talk about is probably more, I think, in terms of transitioning from sim racing into real world, it's more with our staff. So we pride ourselves on developing our staff. And shameless plug, but we offer the Williams Autosport Engineer of the Future Award. So we have engineers that come in as students, and part of their development and program is to work with our esports team. And then what happens from that is then we kind of give them a foot up in their career and help them go into real world. So in our engineers, we have a handful of engineers that have gained real-world experience through working with us and are now, you know, balancing their time as a hybrid, working for the esports team where they can, and then going off and doing real-world opportunities. And I guess sort of on that, I think that's something that should be pushed more and more, is not just focusing on where it can take drivers, but actually where it can take staff. And I think that comes back to the drivers, because it also shows drivers sustainable careers within the industry that they are in. But yeah, I agree with the guys, just to kind of, let's not focus too much on this pipe dream of having someone that's just done sim racing going into an F1 car.
Cool, thanks guys. It sounds like there's a lot of kind of variables at play with it, really. It's such a complex issue, isn't it? That's just well, not plaguing is quite a horrible word and makes it sound really bad, but it's always there. So it's an interesting one to navigate. But to kind of move on into the next segment, we'll go into some individual questions. And we'll start off with Remer. So Remer, you're working at RENNSPORT, working on ESL R1, which is a huge new tournament. I'm sure many people are wondering, when you're launching a new tournament like ESL R1, could you give us a bit of an idea of the kind of strategies or the kind of philosophy that you have to try and make it a success?
Money mostly. No, I'm joking.
Fair enough.
So obviously money helps, but there's a lot more to it than that. So I think to understand a little bit about our approach to sport and racing, we have to understand a little bit the DNA of the company. So one of our co-founders, Marco, the co-CEO, comes from Porsche Motorsport. So he comes from a traditional racing background. And the way he views sport and racing as being very fundamental to the product, right? Because in the real world, often the innovations that you see in production cars come originally from the racetrack. And he views our sporting experience as very important in the same way, right? And in that sense, as we launch this product, right, we have this great opportunity to, as we develop, get all of this feedback from the drivers, and to also make sure that the game is in like an excellent state. Because I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked around professional gaming, but a professional gamer will find every single bug in the entire universe and will break your game repeatedly. So having them around has helped really ensure levels of polish as we develop and to create a really realistic driving experience. So it's been really valuable to have that on side and have that kind of in our DNA.
I mean, it's like a lot of weight on your shoulders, isn't it, to have so much influence in such a big project, right? Which is interesting. I don't know how I do it, but and looking ahead at the future, where do you see the future of competitive sim racing going from where you're sat?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it a bit. I think Kieran mentioned it. I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities here. So I think, for example, the technology is getting better. So on the one hand, we can make the sim experience closer and closer to reality. I was working with our dev team recently, and they were showing us basically tracking data showing how our laps are actually manifesting versus real life track maps, right? And as we adjust some of the parameters, we adjust the development, we can start getting that more and more in line to make that experience more realistic. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a lot of opportunities to do cool stuff. Sim racing has an unbelievably healthy modding community that is underutilized, right? And imagine that you could be racing in tracks in your hometown or in the sky, I mean, like almost like Mario Kart, right? To go really crazy. Probably not that crazy, but where you have a really aggressively real life experience in really incredible environments, or make more interesting tracks that maybe couldn't be manifested or haven't been manifested in real life, right? So there's all these different opportunities for sim racing to develop and to get closer to the real thing. We're working on some technologies I can't talk about, but these will also help bridge this gap between real world and virtual racing and bring it much closer together. And I think as we have more competition in this space, more interest in this space, we're going to have more innovation in this space because, you know, Adam Smith has taught us competition is good. And we're going to see like a lot of really cool stuff coming. I think this is a industry that is pretty ripe for revitalization. And I think this kind of competition is going to help bring that.
Yeah. Thank you, Remer. Really, really good stuff. Moving on, Kieran. So Kieran, you're obviously Formula E, you're effectively the man behind the gaming strategy of Formula E. And so first question would be, you know, how do you balance promoting Formula E in terms of its esports program versus, like, is there like a mix and a balance between also promoting it as a wider, like, real racing category?
Yeah, very much so. I think ultimately gaming for most sports rights holders, I would think, and certainly for Formula E, is another marketing medium first and foremost. Like, of course, we're trying to create products that we can generate new revenue streams from, etc., both B2B and B2C. But I think first and foremost, what we do in gaming is marketing the product. Formula E is only coming into its 10th season now, so it's a very new sport. It's got a great sporting product. It's doing pretty well commercially, but not that many people know about it, right? I think Formula E is well aware of where it sits. That being said, in those 10 years, it's already the 4th biggest motorsport in the world. So it's doing something right. But basically, the gaming strategy was built around that problem question of how can we get more people to give a shit about Formula E, basically. So whatever we do from an esports perspective or licensing with our IP, we're really just trying to market the product and the best bits about our product to that audience. We do have a few bits of IP that are kind of Formula E specific, which allow us to do some cool stuff. Like, we have something in our sport called attack mode, which ultimately is like Mario Kart. If you go off the racing line and you pick up a boost, and then you can use it in the race. We do that in real life, and that's ready-made for a video game. So, you know, stuff like that we lean on. But yeah, everything we're doing is really pushing towards the main sport. Obviously, we want our sim racing product to be a great experience for people viewing and playing. But ultimately, everything we're doing there is trying to tie it back to the main sport. That's why also we've started playing a bit more with not just doing sort of hardcore high-end sim racing stuff, but also leaning into like pro-am style competitions, bringing in gaming influencers, etc., etc. It's not just about the high-end stuff. It's about just getting eyeballs on Formula E and everything that we're doing. So yeah, we've done some cool stuff this year.
Cool. Thank you. And also, I'm a bit conscious of time, so what we'll do is we'll rattle through this next question, if you may, Kieran, not to disrespect you, but I'm really interested to hear, though, from your point of view as well. Obviously, you're at Formula E at the moment, but in the past, and still are, if I'm correct, heavily involved in Excel. And from being positioned in traditional esports and sim racing, like, are there any learnings you've had, or what comparisons would you have learned from seeing both sides?
Yeah, I think very brief, to briefly answer your question, I'll just touch upon what I was talking about there. I think when I've spoken to the sim racing community, most of the sim racers you speak to ultimately want to be real drivers, right? They want to race in real cars and they want to race in real series. So their whole focus is about trying to make that experience as close to real life as possible, and they'll certainly tell you if they don't think it is. I think the learnings that sim racing could take from traditional esports, that's kind of a weird phrase, is actually just to accept that some of the stuff you're going to do is to market the sport or to market the series, and it might not always be about the absolute high-end sim racing. You might actually have to have some fun with it, do some sprint races that that might not make that much sense, but are interesting to watch. And yeah, just be a bit open to have a bit of fun with it is what I would say to the sim racing community. Legend.
Thanks, Kieran. And we move on to Ben. Now, Ben, you're with Williams at the moment. Previously, and I'm well aware, you've got a long background in human performance and sports. And so, with your background, doing everything you did prior, if you could elaborate on a little bit of what you've been doing, how do all of your prior skills translate into our sector so far?
Okay, yeah, I don't really like the idea of sort of talking too much about myself, so I'll skim over a lot of that. But essentially, yeah, my background is in professional sport, both as an aspiring athlete, but more so, incredibly, as a member of staff within professional football, looking at player care, safeguard and education, as well as coaching. So I think kind of for me, I take that question, Tobin, as kind of like, what are the similarities and differences in the two worlds? For me, I'd say obviously there are discipline-specific differences. They're plain to see for everybody. But I think that there's more similarities and potential similarities than meet the eye. So to think about it in terms of a similarity, I would say, and to quote Ollie and use marginal gains again, I'd say sim racing, esports and motorsport, and I guess it's probably motorsport has led into sim racing having this, but they're fixated on the idea of marginal gains. But when I looked at it from the outsider, and don't quote me as being an expert on motorsport and sim racing, but I looked at it and I was like, particularly in sim racing and esports, you're trying to get every single sort of grain or millisecond, if you like, out of the performance side of marginal gains, every single performance gain from a driving perspective, but neglecting the human performance side. So for me, what I'm trying to do is bring that human performance side in. I guess the difference between traditional sport and sim racing, as this example, would be training intensity and the frequency of training. So one thing that was hard for me to adapt coming in was I don't see the players every single day. I'm not out on the training field with them, but also the training itself, the intensity is different. It's physically demanding, and I don't want to take away from that, especially with the work I'm trying to do in human performance, but it's not the same as if you're working with football players. They can only work for a certain amount of hours in the day physically, and then would need recovery time more so. And I find that watching esports and sim racing prior to coming into it, there's kind of this notion of, because the physical intensity isn't there, people grind more, and then the the likelihood of burnout is higher. So we've kind of factored that into our training program and into our human performance program, as well as our driver education. And one of the big things I did in football was start getting the guys to look at life after football. And that's something that we also do at Williams. So we have lifelong learning plans for all of our drivers. So we're talking about all the stuff I've just mentioned, but also sort of future planning and career driven, which is a similarity with real sport, a traditional sport, should I say, but it's relatively new for traditional sport, so we're kind of getting it in early in our program.
Yeah, and kind of leading on from that, as the second question for you, Ben, is at Williams, obviously you mentioned looking after people into the future, and on a more general level, like, do you have any thoughts on how Williams sees the future of sim racing?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've spoken about a number of times already today, and I'm not going to delve too deep because we could be here all day trying to plot what the future might look like, and I think no one really knows. And the problem with it is there are many different viable pathways for sim racing to go in. Obviously, I have a slight bias from my driving force, which is real world sport. But I think just to sort of, and I know that I will be mocked for this probably back at Williams, but just to quote sort of our vision, and it's to create the most holistic high performance environment in esports. And that's what I hope. I actually hope that that's difficult for us, because I hope that other orgs and other platforms are going to try and compete with us on that front, because I think the future of sim racing has to have human performance and welfare at the center of it, both as an esport perspective, but also from a real world perspective as well.
Real. Thank you, Ben. And Ollie, finally, I know we're very much tight on times. I'm so sorry, by the way.
I'll be quick.
But to touch on, at Mercedes, are there any challenges that you guys face to integrate esports into your wider like strategy of how Mercedes is in sports?
Yeah, probably the most relevant to this audience would be that at Mercedes F1, I don't know how many people follow us on social media and in the world, but we've got a very carefully curated and very well-constructed tone of voice that is both respectful of the Mercedes brand, but also allows us to be quite tongue-in-cheek. You know, we take what we do seriously, but we don't take ourselves too seriously, I think would be a good summary. But even then, you know, the brand police of the Mercedes-Benz 8th most valuable brand on the planet puts quite a lot of restrictions in place. So then when you're trying to create a unique voice for a different community, a community of gamers, a community who absorb content in a completely different way, trying to convince the business to loosen the reins a little bit, allow you to have a bit more freedom, but still within that brand, that was quite challenging. I think we're getting there. We've only had esports dedicated channels for a year, but I think, you know, it's one of the things that we've been working quite carefully on. I'll stop there.
Mercedes-Benz still has the best ad campaign in esports history, in my opinion, called Grow Up in Esports. Search on YouTube, it's amazing.
I'll have to check that out. I haven't seen that. And then, Ollie, to wrap up, obviously you're head of the esports stuff at Mercedes, but you've also been working in partnerships for many years. And you know, what's it like in terms of partnerships, and what value add does sim racing bring? Yeah, have you had any lessons there?
I think probably the good place to end, because everything we've said in answer to almost every question summarizes why sim racing is so valuable to potential partners. So the reason I sit across both is for exactly that reason, is that if we can build a team and an organization in sim racing at Mercedes that can achieve all of what we talked about, having compelling content and entertainment, having great drivers doing amazing work on screen, providing great racing, engineers who have a talent pathway to come through, you know, all of that is relevant to companies from across the different sector, B2C and B2B. So we have a separate partner roster in esports to F1, but we do have brands that cross over. AMD, for example, IWC activate in both, and then we have unique partners in esports. So it provides very different opportunities, but it also can provide a unique set of activations on top of a global F1 partnership. So it's my job to try and communicate both. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work as separate pieces. So it's a good challenge, but so far it's been really interesting to work on.
Legend. Thank you so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I think that's a wrap.
Well moderated, well moderated.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Tobin.